I'm not much of a public speaker, so fortunately for y'all, I tried to keep this brief. But when the Sacred Music Campaign Committee asked me to share a few words, I knew that I couldn't say no to the opportunity to express in some small way just how much music has shaped my life and my faith, in hopes that the same just might resonate with someone else. For me, music has always been intensely intertwined with worship. And that's not to say that my relationship with music in worship has been at all static. In fact, it's been quite the contrary, which is why I felt compelled to share my experience here today. My love for music was born at home, singing around the piano with my very musical family and loved ones. But this love for music was cultivated, nurtured, and intensified in the church. I was brought up in a small non-denominational congregation in Charleston, South Carolina, where my mother and my aunt serve as the volunteer music directors and organists, and where I sang in the youth and men's choirs, and eventually accompanied Sunday school services on the piano. For me, music and church, music and God, have been intermingled for as long as I can remember. Even as I advanced in my piano studies as an adolescent and young adult, I remember practicing the standard classical repertoire in preparation for my weekly lessons. But my grandmother would never let my practice sessions end there. She would sweetly listen to whatever Beethoven or Chopin or Bach that I was trying so hard to perfect at the time. And then she'd gently place a hymnal in front of me, turn the page to whatever hymn she wanted to hear at that time, and I knew what to do. To my grandmother, Gran as her grandchildren all call her, music is its finest when it's glorifying God. And I think she just might be right. And what I've come to realize is that indeed, one of the ways I feel closest to God, one of the ways in which I see God most clearly, is through music. I made my way to Florida for my undergraduate studies, and while I remained a card-carrying Christian and considered myself to be still fairly religious, whatever that may mean, the intentional practice of regular worship had found itself considerably lower on my list of priorities. A fellow piano student at the University of Florida and a close friend of mine named Noel had been raised in the Anglican tradition, as his father grew up as an Anglican chorister in Wales. And Noel casually suggested one day that we check out the Episcopal church in town one Sunday. I was a bit reluctant, but he knew just how to get me to agree. He said there will be classical music there. My interest was piqued, and so I went. To my surprise, what I had always considered to be classical music was now being presented and contextualized here in a way that, while I knew was possible in theory, here it was happening right before me as a genuine, unbridled form of worship, coming before God with such beauty. And there it was. Music was my introduction to the Episcopal Church. Noel and I both eventually joined that church choir, Holy Trinity Episcopal in Gainesville, Florida. And I found myself not worshiping because I was being told to worship. Instead, I was worshiping because I couldn't help but worship, through a medium that made so much sense to me, through a medium that engaged every one of the things that God had placed inside of me that made me tick. Fast forward several years later to 2011, I moved to New York to start my surgical residency at Mount Sinai Hospital. And again, I found myself in a new city with loads of distractions and a job that demanded so much of my time. And just like that, intentional regular worship had once again been displaced from my list of priorities. Thanks to a handy guide to Episcopal churches of New York City that the assistant organist in my previous church had compiled for me before I moved here, I decided to give St. Bart's a try for the Christmas Eve service. This was to be my first Christmas away from my family. I felt alone and sad beyond belief, but I knew I needed to be in the house of God. The choir that evening started to sing the absolutely beautiful Mass setting by George Malcolm, my first time hearing the work. And that music pierced right through me. It pierced through all my feelings of loneliness, and in that moment, unexpectedly and strangely, I felt at home. It was a feeling and a fact that I simply could not shake. The power of beautiful sacred music had done it yet again. At that point, I knew I had to find a new church home here in New York. And while I so desperately wanted to fall in love with another Episcopal parish that was so much closer to my apartment, literally a 5-minute walking distance, I was repeatedly drawn back to this place. The radical welcome, the thought-provoking preaching, and the music. I have experienced God in ways I had never imagined in this sacred space, and in no small part due to the sacred music that is offered here in sincerity, in earnest, and in truth. Music brought me back to the church. Music brought me to the Episcopal Church. And music brought me to St. Bart's. I know my story is mine, but I also know that this story is probably not so unique to me. And I imagine that many among you have seen God and experienced God and his peace through music in transformative ways. And this is why the Sacred Music Campaign and our financial support to the music program here at St. Bart's is so important, to allow this immensely crucial ministry to be the best that it can be, to glorify God, and to allow this ministry to be the most far-reaching that it can be. Because if we can help anyone to see God, why wouldn't we? Thank you.